My name is Siemon Allen. I'm an artist who grew up in Durban, and I studied sculpture originally at the Natal Technikon, now DUT. What's interesting about this particular project, the stamp piece that's behind me here, is that it's part of a body of work that I made when I first left art school. So it's this first group of works that I concentrated on after leaving art school. And I was very interested in this idea of the display case. And I was working with a number of artifacts from my youth. So for example, what you see behind me is my original schoolboy stamp collection. But the works that form part of this series included other artifacts, for example, my Hardy Boys books, sort of minor idiosyncratic artifacts that defined my identity as I was growing up as a young white South African boy. I think with the work, these artifacts, I was exploring, what it was like to grow up in that context. And some of the other projects from this series include a pair of Doc Martens shoes and model airplanes and compact discs, just the ephemera of daily life. The display case that you can see, each of these projects had its own display case, and one of the things I was interested in was isolating those objects. So the display case becomes a device, like a museum device, where the work is separated, almost made into a kind of an icon, if you like. I think in the most simplest sense, a lot of my work deals with this idea of repetition. I'm also very interested in the series, and in this particular case, we have a collection of stamps. So there's one stamp. We use stamps every day. Well, we used to use stamps every day before email. And that would be like an individual stamp. But in this case, it's a collection of stamps. So I would see that as one in the many. But I'm also, with a lot of my other work, I do a lot of work with collections of artifacts. And so this, interestingly, is probably one of the first projects that I worked with this idea of a very large series, the grid, the one in the many becomes the object in a way. The challenges I faced with this piece was made in 1993, so it's already 32 years old. Just being a young artist at the time. So a little bit of background about this piece. I made it in Durban, and then I was invited to do a two-person exhibition at the ICA in Johannesburg, invited by Gordon Froude, who I believe was the director or the curator at that time. I think the challenges for me at that time as a young artist were making the work, renting a trailer, and driving that all the way to Johannesburg. The emotions and thoughts I would like viewers to experience when they see this work, well, I think in a way a lot of my work is very unemotional. It's very minimal. Perhaps older South Africans, when they look at the stamps, many of them will remember some of these stamps. And so I think the kind of emotion that might come from that would be a form of nostalgia, perhaps. I guess the central idea is more a kind of a museum-like quality, where you're looking at these historical artifacts. They're behind glass. You're not using them. You're not licking the stamps. They're unavailable to you, and it's more tracing a history. One of the things that I'm very interested in, and this is the first of a number of series that I continued working on. So the stamps, this particular stamp piece was from 1993, but then I did a number of iterations of the project. The final version of this piece I completed in 2010 and was recently, in the last couple of years, exhibited at the Johannesburg Contemporary Art Foundation. That version of this piece is massive. This is very small, intimate. These are my own personal stamps, whereas the other larger installations that came after this using stamps were all collected for those particular projects. And one of the things I'm very interested in, and just coming back to this idea of what somebody would see or what somebody would feel when viewing these pieces is I'm very interested in tracing a history of South Africa through this mediated image. So, for example, these are all postal stamps. They're all a form of propaganda. You are not going to see the full image of South Africa. These are images of South Africa that are sent all over the world on letters and things like that. And so it's not necessarily a false image. They contain bits of information that are historical, but it is definitely a one-sided image, if you like. And so I think for me, I want the project to trace that history. That is most evident in the later versions of this piece, and this earlier version just starts to hint at that. And so it's a more like a private collection, youthful. There is not every single stamp as in the later works, but this is more like a sketch of a future idea. One of the things I'd like people to notice in the work, one thing that's common to most of my work is that it is the images or the objects are arranged chronologically. This particular work is the first example where I use that system of arranging the stamps or the images, the objects chronologically. And so if you're looking at it, reading from left to right, the very earliest stamps are in this top left-hand corner, and then they go chronologically down till the last stamps at the bottom right-hand corner, which were some of the last stamps that I collected as a young boy. Some of the other odd details which a viewer may or may not glean from this is if you're looking at when you use a stamp postally, it gets franked, which is like that black ink. And that usually, what that represents is a decommissioning of the stamp, so to say that the stamp has been used and you can't use it again. But if you look at a lot of the black franks, the ink on the stamps, you'll see that a lot of them are from Durban and Pinetown, KwaZulu-Natal area, and that's partly because that's where I was living and collecting the stamps, but also my grandmother worked for the Durban Corporation in the 1970s and 80s, and she was the letter opener when people would send their bills in and whatnot. And so she would come home every day with a pile of stamps. And so in a way, I could say she is responsible for getting me into the stamp collecting. But that I may not be a detail that anyone could necessarily glean from this piece visually. One of the quite important detail I think about this piece is that not only would I get stamps from my grandmother, but I also used to visit a bookstore called Adams in Durban, and they had stamps for sale back in those days, and not stamps for postal use, but stamps for collectors. And so they would have various stamps on display. And so some of these stamps were bought from Adams back then. But the key thing about this piece is that the display case is the Adams bookstore display case. Around 1992, the people were less interested in stamp collecting, and so Adams, the store, decided to decommission the whole area, the section of the store. And I saw that they had the stamp case on display, so I purchased it. So this is not only there's a kind of a meta thing going on there where the stamps that I bought are now displayed in the display case that I originally saw them in. And so that is a very subtle thing, and I suppose it'll only be available to people that hear this interview. What do I hope this piece will add to the broader conversation around South African art? One of the things that I feel is important about this particular body of work when I was working on it, I grew up at the time. Sue Williamson's book of resistance art had just come out, and we all studied many of those artists so we as young artists, we looked up to those artists. And at the time, the book Spring is Rebellious came out, and we were all drawn to this critique, I think, that Albie Sachs was making about so-called traditional resistance art at that time. And he was calling for kind of a exploration of a broader freedom, that work doesn't necessarily have to be about the struggle, but can be about larger issues that use the freedom that you've gained to explore many different things. So this work does talk about propaganda. It does talk about growing up in apartheid South Africa, the kind of images that I was seeing when I was a young kid. And yet it is also quite, when you look at it in the context of, say, resistance art of those days, it is also quite aloof from that. It's very subtle. It references this broader issue of apartheid, and yet it sort of stands apart from it or aloof from it. It's almost like just a photograph of a period, I would say. One other thing I would say about this body of work is that for me it was like a rite of passage, leaving art school, becoming a young artist, a young South African artist, driving up to Johannesburg, driving up to Pretoria. An interesting anecdote about this body of work was that there were two other pieces that were exhibited alongside the stamp collection at that time. And the curious thing was that the first piece that I had made was first exhibited at the Volkskus in 1993, which happened to be here at the University of Pretoria, the final exhibition. And thankfully, on that exhibition, I won a merit award. And in a funny way, what's so curious about that is that then led to this other body of work that was then shown in Johannesburg. But for me, it becomes quite important, or I think it's kind of curious that that first experience out of Durban was here in Pretoria. I remember driving up here for the exhibition and being in Pretoria. It was the first time I was ever up here. So that's an odd detail, but it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit.